This conference will now be recorded.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the second webinar of our series on Integrated Water Asset Management, or IWAM. Thank you so much for joining us. Our focus for today's webinar is going to be on water infrastructure financing and how it relates to asset management. Our panel of experts are going to cover this topic from a variety of perspectives and talk about some current financing opportunities, options for expanding financial support for IWAM, and also exploring the relationship between asset management financing and the creation of stormwater utilities, as well as how asset management can support and improve utility rate setting. So my name is Dan Gold, and I'm GLC's IWAM project manager, and I'm joined here in our office by Ned Willig, who I'm working very closely with on this project. So before we get started, I'd like to go over a few logistics. We currently have the audience on mute, and we request that you stay muted for the panelist presentation portion of today's webinar. We're going to be holding all questions until our three presentations are complete. Please feel free to type questions into the chat box as our presenters are speaking, and we'll read them at the end of the presentations. Also, the final half hour of our 90-minute webinar today is going to be used for a Q&A session as well as open discussion. And at that time, we'll invite you all to unmute yourself if you'd like to join in on the conversation. One final administrative note, and I'll probably announce this again for late comers, to make sure that we capture attendance, if you would comment your name and who you work for or your affiliation in the comment box, we would appreciate that. And also, today's webinar is being recorded, so you can always check on it later on, or if you have colleagues who might be interested but weren't able to attend, that'll be available for them. And we'll be sending out a follow-up with the link to the recording later. So I'm going to go over our agenda today briefly. I'm going to start off by giving a brief project overview of who the Great Lakes Commission is, as well as why we're pursuing this the IWAM project. Then the majority of this webinar will be hearing from our presenters, and today our panelists include Jeff Hughes from the Environmental Finance Center at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, Robert Booz, who's with the Pennsylvania Infrastructure Investment Authority, or PennVest, as well as Mark Hoskins and Jay Kesson, who are joining us from the Illinois Department of Natural Resources, Office of Water Resources. So as you'll be hearing from them shortly, they all have complementary expertise and unique perspectives when it comes to financing options and considerations for asset management and asset management planning. And then, as I said before, the final half hour will be used for Q&A and open discussion, where we invite you all to ask questions of our panelists. So a bit of background on this project. First of all, the Great Lakes Commission, for those who don't know, is an interstate compact agency that was established under state and U.S. federal law that's dedicated to promoting a strong economy, healthy environment, and high quality of life for the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence region and its residents. The Commission consists of governors, appointees, state legislators, and agency officials from the 8 Great Lake member states. The provinces of Ontario and Quebec also have associate member status. More specifically with IWAM, in 2017, along with partners from several member states and provinces, the GLC staff set out to investigate the need for increased financing for water infrastructure in the Great Lakes Basin and concluded that there's a significant investment gap that's projected to grow each year if nothing changes. Our findings were summarized in our Joint Action Plan for Clean Water Infrastructure and Services, which is available on the GLC website, and I invite you all to go check out. This action plan also included a series of recommended actions at various levels of government to mitigate this gap. Our top recommendation called for increased regional coordination for water infrastructure asset management, as well as the need to comprehensively inventory and assess the current state of Great Lakes water infrastructure assets. The action plan was officially endorsed by the Great Lakes Commission in 2017. We received funding from the Joyce Foundation in 2018, and that funding has allowed us to try to implement our top recommendations and pursue this project. So now that I've covered who we are and why we're taking on this work, I'm going to give a brief breakdown of exactly what we intend to do. First, we're hosting a series of webinars, of which you are all attending. So in addition to today's webinar, we're going to be inviting you to join us for 2 more that will both take place in April and are going to focus on other key aspects and considerations of effective integrated water asset management. The first webinar that we hosted last month is currently available on the GLC website's IWAM page. The third webinar is going to be focused on available technology and how it relates to asset management. And the fourth webinar is going to be bringing our entire series together when we're going to hear from leaders in the field who are planning to, or in some cases have already implemented some form of state or provincial level integrated water asset management program. And of note, that webinar is going to include speakers from both the US and Canada. In addition to the web series, we're also planning a couple of focus groups that are going to take place this spring, where we're going to be gathering information on barriers, opportunities, and best practices from individual communities or possibly specific regions with an interest in advancing IWAM activities. So some anticipated outcomes of all of this work. The first will be an IWAM Phase 1 report, where we're going to be summarizing a lot of what we've learned through these focus groups and webinars. And it's going to be an assessment of regional barriers, opportunities, and best practices for catalyzing IWAM in the Great Lakes Basin. So you can look out for that this summer. The second major deliverable was going to be a proposal that also serves as a work plan for Phase 2 of the IWAM project, where we aspire to implement the best practices and other recommendations that come out of our Phase 1 assessment report. So of note, Phase 2 is not yet funded, so we're also looking at these webinars and focus groups as networking opportunities to build support for this future phase of our project, either by identifying key leaders who we might ask later down the line to provide us with letters of support and serve on a regional IWAM advisory group, or another way we're engaging with people is by keeping an eye out for communities that could be potential pilot locations for this forthcoming Phase 2 of IWAM, where we hope to implement our recommendations. Okay, so to set a little bit of a baseline for this project, I'd like to first explain what we mean by integrated. First, we mean integrated across siloed sectors, and that could be drinking water, wastewater, stormwater, and green stormwater infrastructure. We feel that there could be a benefit to better integrating the management of these siloed sectors to increase efficiencies and just provide benefits for the entire closed loop water system. Taking this idea even further, we're interested in exploring ways to include the transportation sector, communication, and energy, and really anything else that municipalities or communities are tasked with managing that impact water infrastructure, which could be nearly anything. The second way that we mean integrated is regionally and geographically. We're investigating ways that local communities can better coordinate with each other at the county, state, provincial, and even national level to increase the effectiveness and efficiency of asset management. So going back to what I said earlier about the Great Lakes Commission being a regional and international organization, you can understand that we're well poised to help start conversations and look for opportunities to share best practices and increase coordination of water infrastructure asset managers across the entire Great Lakes Basin. So the final thing that I would like to talk about is, why are we focusing an entire webinar on financing? So is there a need for dedicated asset management financing? So first, I'll direct your attention to this figure from the US EPA, which many of you may be familiar with, and it's a pretty elegant diagram that lays out the 5 core questions that need to be considered to create an effective asset management program. So as you can see, having a long-term funding strategy is one of those key elements. Based on our research here at the GLC, we definitely agree with that. And I would also argue that having effective asset management in place is hugely important if you wish to increase the longevity and useful life of physical assets, which will minimize life cycle costs and ultimately allow utilities to be more efficient with whatever financing they do receive. So moving beyond this very general idea of why financing is important, I'd like to refer you all to this investment gap figure, and I've plucked this out of our Joint Action Plan for Clean Water Infrastructure Services, which once again I would invite everybody on the line to take a look at. As I mentioned earlier, there's a massive and ever-growing investment gap for water infrastructure in the Great Lakes Basin. And when we undertook the task of quantifying this gap, we used the best available data, most of which from the U.S. side came from the U.S. EPA's Clean Water and Drinking Water Needs surveys. In doing that research, we identified significant data gaps, including the fact that EPA's data isn't exactly comprehensive. It's extrapolated from a subset of primary data that's taken, it's collected voluntarily from selected systems and then extrapolated for the whole, for entire states. Also, these estimates from the EPA, they don't account for population growth, dam maintenance, lead service line replacement, fire suppression infrastructure, or the needs of private wells and septic systems. So those are some of the reasons that I've become pretty convinced that this $271 billion value that we were able to come up with is very possibly a significant underestimate of what the actual needs for water infrastructure financing are. And the final and perhaps the most obvious point I'd like to make is that this estimate for monetary needs, it doesn't account for the finances that would be needed to create and implement a state-of-the-art asset management program. So when I look at this number, I interpret it to mean that if the Great Lakes Basin communities were able to come up with the $271 billion required to get all water infrastructure up to par over the next 20 years, we would be somewhat setting ourselves up to repeat the same mistake of previous generations who at one point maybe made a big push to implement water infrastructure, but failed to account for the need to manage and maintain it in the long term. So basically, we see the need for dedicated financing to implement asset management, and more specifically, we hope, integrated water asset management to avoid repeating this same cycle. Okay, and so that's what I have by way of background for today. And now turning to, I think, the more interesting portion of today's webinar, I'd like to hand over control to our first panelist, who is Jeff Hughes from the Environmental Finance Center at UNC Chapel Hill for his presentation titled Rate Setting and Asset Management. Hey, Jeff, if you could unmute yourself, we can see your screen, but we can't hear you yet.
Okay, there you go. Hopefully everybody can hear me now and see my screen.
Yep, you're good to go. Thanks, Jeff.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Really happy to be part of the agenda for this afternoon. The organizers asked me to talk a little bit about the relationship between rate setting and asset management, and I'm just going to give some highlights today of some of what we've seen in our work, and talk a little bit about some strategies that we've seen work in the past and we think are going to be essential moving forward. Just a quick word about the Environmental Finance Center. We're part of the UNC School of Government, and we focus on a variety of different environmental media. So we work on water and wastewater, watershed protection, and we also do that through different channels. So we'll do traditional university research, but then we also work quite a bit in professional education programs, program design and evaluation of actual funding programs. So what I'm going to talk to you today is going to be pulled primarily from our applied research and some of the experiences that we've learned from teaching and outreach and other direct experiences we've had with practitioners across the country. If you are interested in a little bit more in our center and some of the materials I'm going to talk about, you can go to environmentalfinance.org. That's our URL. I will say it's our 20th birthday this year. We have a lot of material. Sometimes it's a little hard to navigate in our website, but I think some of the things I'm going to talk about today, you should be able to get to fairly easily. As this map on the right says, while we are in North Carolina and do work quite a bit in the southeastern part of the United States, we do have projects ongoing in other parts of the country, including we've worked fairly extensively in some parts of the Great Lake region. So not completely coming in blind for this discussion. I did want to briefly thank again the Great Lakes Commission for inviting me to talk about this. Always enjoy sharing our thoughts. I'm going to pull from a couple projects that we have, and I wanted to make sure our key partners on those projects get some thanks. One is I'm going to share with you some insight that we've gained from the rates work that we do, particularly in Wisconsin, and wanted to thank the Public Service Commission for being our key partner for that project. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work that's funded through the Environmental Protection Agency. If you do go to our website, you'll see a lot of tools and a lot of different material designed to help practitioners in the area of rate setting and asset management. We have state-level rate surveys that you can take a look at. We're currently in about 15 states, including several in the Great Lakes regions. We do a lot of utility rate and modeling work specifically for utilities, so there's some do-it-yourself analysis tools that you can download. And then we have some specialty analysis tools, like if you're interested in looking at the affordability of rates for a particular community, if you're interested in doing some of that long-term financial planning that we heard about at the outset, we have some tools that can be used for that, and then we have a number of general guides. I like to start my presentations with kind of giving you the bottom line. Rates and asset management are intrinsically connected. You can't separate out the two. Assets generate the revenue that you need to actually charge rates, and rates are key to maintaining your assets. No rates, no assets, no revenue. So that's hopefully an obvious takeaway, but we should keep that in mind when we're starting to go down the path of asset management. More precisely, we're finding that if your rates are insufficient, and there are many utilities in many parts of the country where I think we are finding that, that's one of the sure predictors of insufficient asset management or assets that are not being maintained in a way that protects public health and the environment. We do find that many utilities have worked hard to set rates to generate revenue to cover their operation and maintenance, including some basic asset management. But we're finding more and more utilities that are not able to go that extra yard and generate revenue for serious capital renewal and replacement, which is a big component of asset management. And the final thing, if it was easy, everybody would be doing this. And one of the reasons it's not easy is because to get to the rates that many utilities will need to generate the needed revenue and to establish a long-term funding program, it means that for some households, not all, but at least for some, it may exceed what they can readily afford. And we know that that is a big obstacle that we've been trying to work on and that a lot of communities are trying to work on. This is just an excerpt from a recent survey that we did that I find is quite informative. We asked water utilities across North Carolina to comment on their rates and what they can do with the rates that they have. And you'll see by this chart, the good news is that over half of the utilities we talked to responded that they have rates that are sufficient to maintain a strong fiscal condition. The unfortunate thing about this research and other similar studies that we've done all over the country is, in this case, it's showing over 40% of utilities reporting that they don't have the rates and the revenue to fully cover their capital needs. And that's really an ongoing problem, and it makes for asset management especially sophisticated asset management systems, very difficult. We have done some research in the Great Lakes region. I'm going to talk a little bit about Wisconsin because that's where we've done the most work. This slide just shows the number of utilities that when we look at their finance reports, we see that they are reporting rates that are not sufficient to cover depreciation. And covering depreciation is an indicator of whether rates are generating extra revenue that can be used for new capital investment. The orange utilities, and you can see for example, the utilities that are below 1,000 in size, there's over 60 of them in Wisconsin. Those orange shaded utilities are not generating enough revenue from their rates to cover the depreciation of their assets. So that's essentially a worrisome situation because while you can pay for your folks to go out and fix emergency repairs and you may be able to pay the electric bill, you can't generate enough revenue to do some of the forward-thinking investment that we know most water utilities need. This is what not funding depreciation looks like in the field. And these are all photos of utilities where we've worked where we know their rates are not generating sufficient revenue to take care of the assets. They're able to send water out and they're able to treat wastewater to very basic standards. But when you go behind the scenes and look at their assets, this is the kind of pictures we see. So you can tell that these utilities and these situations are in dire need of improved asset management. A lot of our work comes from a comparative analysis tool that we've developed that we implement in a number of states across the country, including Wisconsin. You can see on your screen now just an excerpt from one of our rates dashboard. This is a tool that allows utilities and state agencies to quickly assess the financial condition of utilities in a geographic region. I'm not going to go through all the bells and whistles on this tool, but I did want to show you that some of what this tool allows you to do is to quickly see if rates are generating sufficient revenue to cover depreciation. And that's that right-hand dial that you see over there. And in this particular case, for the community of Fairchild, they are generating enough revenue to cover some basic depreciation, but probably not enough revenue to cover a lot of advanced asset management. This kind of analysis also shows a big problem I want to finish up with, and that's affordability. If you look at the right-hand dial, that's one of many indicators for judging affordability. It's not the best by any means, but what that indicator shows is the percentage of median household income spent on water bills. And in this particular community, that number is over 3.5%, which is problematic. This is some other results of that tool, and in this particular case, you can see some more detailed financial information. And if you just look to the bottom left, you'll see in this particular community a fairly high poverty rate. We are seeing all across the country communities with high poverty rates, with low incomes, and very high water rates having a really hard time with asset management. We're seeing bills exceed $100 in many parts of the country, a number that we never would have thought of possible about 10 years ago. We're seeing rates growing faster than income. So while it's still a great deal, in most situations, it is getting people's attention. What are people doing about all of these issues? I'm just going to finish off with a couple quick notes. We're seeing utilities that have more frequent rate adjustments able to keep pace a little bit more. And you can see in Wisconsin up here, we have a number of utilities that are now adjusting rates almost every year. We still see a situation where some utilities are only adjusting rates once every 3 or 4 or 5 years, and that makes for a very difficult situation. We are again promoting that rates are set not only just to generate the operating costs, but to be able to generate some extra money for capital, possibly using sinking funds. And then the last thing is, while I've shown you some ways of comparing your rates with other people's rates, we are really promoting that anything in this area be done with care. Certainly, analysis requires looking beyond just rates. It needs to look at the quality of asset management. Needs to look at a lot of issues related to the specific community. So again, things that we promote in our work and our training programs. There are things you can do. There are education campaigns that can help boards see the value of more frequent rate increases. There are customer assistance programs that utilities can implement that might take the edge away of some of the affordability challenges. So those are just some ideas to leave you with. And I think with that, I'm going to pass it over to my other colleagues to take over their part of the webinar.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Jeff. Our next speaker is going to be Robert Boos from Penvest, and his talk is titled Funding Clean Water Projects. And also, on an administrative note, for anybody who signed in late, if you could just comment in the comment box your name and your affiliation, who you work for, to make sure that we fully capture attendance today, that would be great. And with that, we'll pass it over to Robert.
All right, just double checking everyone can hear me good?
Yep, we see you and hear you.
Excellent. Well, thank you again for having me, and I'll just give a little bit of background for those that might be unfamiliar with our organization. Penvest is an infrastructure and financing authority that essentially oversees and manages the state's revolving loan fund. We've been around for 31 years, and our primary objective and goal here is to fund clean water projects. You can see since our inception over the 31 years by this map, we funded projects in all counties of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. If you look at some of the concentrations on the map, you can notice kind of down in the southwest corner where Pittsburgh is, and there's a higher population center there. You see a few more projects as opposed to maybe the rural nature of north central PA that is significantly more rural and is made up more of state forest land and those types of things. But that kind of gives you an idea of the extent and the activity we have currently within the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Again, our primary task is funding clean water projects. Historically, we've primarily been focused on drinking water and wastewater treatment plants over the last 30 years. In the more recent years, that's kind of expanded to include on-lot systems, sewer lateral replacements, new sewer connections, stormwater, acid mine drainage, brownfield projects. And to date, we've done about 3,800 projects, and our total expenditures to date we financed $8.7 billion. Currently, our budget's $570 million, and we expect to be able to maintain that kind of budgeted level moving forward in the foreseeable future to help support the needs within the infrastructure demand. We do answer to a board. We have 4 board meetings a year, and with that, we have application cutoffs, and you can kind of see we basically essentially meet quarterly so that we can, in a timely fashion, process applications, award funding, and help expedite the implementation of infrastructure projects. It's interesting to note that when comparing how quickly we can complete applications with folks, our average application time frame from the time an application is submitted and getting it awarded and a funding offer out is about 6 months. And in other states, the average time is about 2 years. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that we meet more frequently. Some folks only meet once a year, but just kind of a method in which we're trying to get those funds out as quickly as possible. Within the different categories of the types of projects we fund, you'll note here that within all of those categories, we do have the ability to not only fund public systems, but also private. So it could be a private mobile home park, it could be a private company with a wastewater treatment plant, it could be a homeowners association, clear up to a municipal authority. So we have the flexibility and the ability to fund both private and public applications. To kind of understand how Penvest works, we're essentially a low interest loan program. And with that, most of our rates are below market rates. So we're actually providing a subsidy to help implement those projects and make them more affordable. The left side where it says scenario 1 is just kind of a standard scenario for folks that come to Penvest, 20 years, loan period, 1% interest on an annual rate for every $1 million that they're borrowing. They're going to pay back interest of 103, so it's 1.1 million being repaid for every $1 million borrowed. Same scenario or type of comparison in scenario 2, but with a 40-year 2%. You can see how the interest being owed over the life of that repayment is higher. And then scenario 3, 15 years at more of a closer market interest rate of 4.5. You can see how the total interest here is $376,000, and even the repayment is going to be higher than if they used Penvest financing in scenario 1. When we're looking at our funding determinations on financing infrastructure, all of our funding recommendations to the board are based on affordability rates. And we have a process in which we calculate what we believe to be affordable for a community based on 16 different socioeconomic factors, median household income, unemployment rates, and things of that nature. And if a community meets one of our hardship criteria in an effort to try and get it to their affordable or their target rate, we may extend financing from 20 years to 30 years. We might look at supplementing some of the funding offer with grant funds to make it more affordable, or we might look at extending to the 30 years or reducing the interest rate, trying to meet that affordable rate or that target rate, recognizing that each community has a different ability to handle debt service. All of our programs are online. We're the only revolving financing authority within the United States that has a cradle to grave process for application, disbursement, settlement, follow-up reporting, construction, funds disbursement, implementation. Everything we do is through our electronic portal. And the way we work is we work with different partners. We work with Department of Environmental Protection, which is kind of our technical consultants that look at the different public health, safety, environmental compliance, adequacy, and efficiencies of systems. We also look at the Department of Community and Economic Development to look at job growth and economic factors associated with the types of clean water projects. And essentially, Penvest is the bank. We're looking at what's affordable and the financial capability of a system as like any bank would. Now, more along the lines of what today's webinar is about, I just wanted to give you a background of kind of what Penvest is, what we do, how we do it, and within that structure, we do look at asset management as being important and critical to infrastructure clean water projects, because the reality of it is, as previously described, is there's just not enough funding out there. We don't have enough grant money to meet the demand of what's requested to get people to an affordable rate. Right now, we got about 40. We can meet about 40% of that grant demand to make projects affordable to people. And recognizing that we can't, excuse me, continue the cycle of build it, wait till it wears out, then replace it in its entirety. We really want to encourage folks to properly operate and maintain their systems with utilization of an asset management plan. So what we've done to incentivize that within the structure that we're able to is we've increased, every project's ranked, and it's a competitive process. So if you have an asset management plan or are implementing an asset management plan, we will increase your ranking points because to encourage people to take those steps. We'll also allow the development of an asset management plan up to, as an eligible cost, up to a maximum, of $25,000. Now, obviously, $25,000 on a very large system is probably inadequate to develop a fully functional asset management plan. And it might even be inadequate to fully develop an asset management plan even for a smaller system. However, again, what we're doing is we're trying to incentivize it. We don't have the capacity or the ability to handle the costs associated with all systems for implementing this effort. But again, this is a little bit of a carrot to help get people starting to think along these lines moving forward. Also, as part of some federal legislation that occurred in 2014 under the WRDA bill, all clean water projects, CWSRF projects, primarily wastewater treatment systems, have to do a fiscal sustainability plan as part of their project for that part of the project that is financed. So if, let's say, a sewage treatment plant is adding some pump stations, they would have to do that fiscal sustainability plan just for those pump stations. What's being funded as part of PennVest financing for that specific project. It doesn't cover, and we recognize and acknowledge it doesn't cover everything in the system, but again, these are steps just being taken to help encourage and incentivize folks to be moving forward with these steps towards asset management. Now, one thing I will point out is our program is a construction program. We do not fund operation and maintenance of facilities, fund or finance O&M for facilities. So our ability to move in that direction to support the ongoing implementation of plans is very limited. But our whole intent here is, again, I said, is to help people to start be thinking about it, taking maybe that first step and trying to incentivize or encourage them to do so. Now with that, how are we doing? It's interesting in that though there's a lot of talk about the importance of asset management and people recognize that importance, we're finding that very few folks are taking advantage of these incentives that PennVest is providing. And we're always looking at our programs, how can we do them better? If something's not working, should we be doing something different, or should we just be doing improving something? And with the asset management, what we really find is local municipalities, local officials are really trying to keep costs down, recognizing the expense that it takes to properly operate and maintain facilities, and just trying to do the bare minimum while maintaining what's affordable. And with that in mind, as was previously discussed in the first presentation, it's very difficult, and there are funds lacking, and there is a gap there to facilitate and help communities in an ongoing basis with that. So I did want to point out that we are just a construction program, but that ongoing O&M, there doesn't seem to be funding there or funding that we can help with in doing that. So with that, I'll be available for questions later on. If anyone's interested more in what PennVest does, what our tools are, how our process works, you can just go to our website. All of our links and capacities are listed there. You can also follow us on Facebook for any up-to-date news or items of interest on what's happening in Pennsylvania. So with that, I'll turn it over to the Great Lakes, and we can move forward to the next presentation.
Great. Thanks, Robert. That was a great presentation. And our next up is going to be Mark Hoskins and Jay Kesson joining us from the Illinois Department of Natural Resources, Office of Water Resources. And their presentation is titled Stormwater Utility Fees and Asset Management. So we can see you. If you could unmute I think we've just unmuted you, Mark.
Try again.
Okay, can you hear us now?
Yep. Hey, Mark. Hey, Jay. Take it
Okay.
Hey.
This is Jay, and it's truly a pleasure to be presenting today. Today's presentation is meant to give everyone a brief introduction regarding stormwater utilities and how they can be used to fund asset management programs. With that, let's get started. And I think okay. Well, let's begin with exploring what stormwater utility fees are. First, they are a funding mechanism that generates a dedicated revenue stream for a community stormwater management program. Specifically, the fee-based revenue can only be used for stormwater-related activities, not potable water, wastewater, police, fire, or any other activity for that matter. Second, it's a fee, not a tax. Therefore, every property owner pays for their relative contribution to the management of stormwater within their community. Unlike a tax, properties that are traditionally tax exempt, such as faith institutions and schools, must pay their fee. Third, stormwater utilities are typically capacity-based as opposed to consumption-based. A consumption-based approach would require actual metering of runoff from each parcel, which would be impractical. Therefore, a surrogate, such as percent impervious, is used to estimate the relative demand for service. And we'll discuss that in a little more detail a little later. Fourth, they're popular because they provide a defined level of service. The fee is based upon specific activities to be performed. The fee is developed through a detailed evaluation of the expected program costs over a specific time frame. Therefore, it's quite clear to the public what they're paying for. And fifth, a stormwater utility is flexible. You may fund your entire stormwater management program or only pieces of it, such as asset management. So how have the number of stormwater utilities changed over time? Well, there were only a handful of stormwater utilities in the U.S. in the 1970s. In fact, there were only 10 or so. And the number was still less than 100 by the end of the 1980s. The number skyrocketed in the 90s due to a number of drivers, but the most significant of these were likely the need to fund a community's MS4 NPDES program and significant flood events that occurred, including the historic 1993 Mississippi River flood. Currently, there are over 1,600 documented stormwater utilities in the U.S. and nearly 30 in Canada, although some sources believe that the number of utilities in the U.S. may be much higher due to the fact that they are popular and new programs are being added frequently. From a legal standpoint, stormwater utilities must meet three criteria. First, there must be a rational nexus. That is, the runoff generated on a property is directly proportional to the impact on stormwater. An example of a poor rational nexus would be basing the fee on a property owner's potable water consumption. And yes, there are some communities that do this. Second, the voluntary nature of the program can be achieved through offering incentives, which are a one-time payment to the property owner, and credits, which are an ongoing reduction in the property owner's fee. These incentives and credits are related to activities such as the installation of green infrastructure practices and other on-site stormwater management controls and activities that reduce the volume of runoff from the property. The property owner is generally responsible for approaching the community administering the fee to request the incentive or credit. And lastly, there must be a dedicated regulatory purpose. That is, an ordinance must be adopted that will guarantee that the revenue generated by the stormwater utility fee will be placed in a designated stormwater fund. With that, I'm going to pass it over to Mark.
Thanks, Jay. Okay, why would you start a stormwater utility fee? Why would you even do that? Generally, there's three reasons. And when we get to the third one, you'll see why that's the most important. There's regulatory requirements, which can be very significant. The MS4 and NPDES Phase 2, replacing aging infrastructure. ASCE puts out the report card every year, and I think the whole nation is somewhere around a D or C minus. So it's a huge problem, and especially with stormwater where it's out of sight, out of mind. And then the third I would suggest would be flooding. Generally, a flood event is a trigger for a stormwater utility, and it may be related to the other two issues. So what I did was I took a snapshot from NOAA, which they offer these total rainfall maps, and I overlaid them. There's actually 5 more of them, but we don't have the space to talk about that today. And you can see these bands, generally from west to east, of rainfall amounts, and they're very significant. And climate change is another phenomenon which has been documented many times over, and something you might want to consider when you're setting your rate. Okay, what are we going to talk about? Again, process. So we're going to talk about certain steps towards implementing a stormwater utility. Just going to start off with a feasibility study. That's generally done internally, where a consultant, and there's consultants out there, you probably know who they are, where you can go and talk with them and try to outline your costs and what your plans are for your village, or your municipality, or your county. And that generally comes down to what type of funding activities. And then the middle 2 slides, we have a credit manual, and then that planning process I talked about. And then so important to a stormwater utility is outreach. In fact, I would suggest that there's 3 things you have to know, and it's the old joke of location, location, location. In this case, it's outreach, outreach, outreach. If you don't have that, forget it. Pretty much you can pack it in and go back to some sort of a fixed fee or another way to generate your revenue. I like the slide on the bottom far right, where the public works director is standing inside of one of the culvert pipes that he's putting in. The enormity and the expense of these improvements is a lot. And it takes a dedicated funding source, such as a stormwater utility, to do it, in my opinion. What can you use this money for? Jay alluded to, pretty much you shouldn't be using it for potable water or sewer or other I'll call them utilities. It has to be used for stormwater related, thus the term stormwater utility fee. And generally those are the 3 main categories of regulatory, maintenance, and capital improvements. And you can see that going across there. And one of them I have multicolor because it kind of both ways. Capital improvement will become maintenance after it's put in the ground. Okay, how can we structure the stormwater fee to meet the needs of my community? There are, first off, there's consultants, as I alluded to earlier, who you talk to help you do this. Nationwide, the ERU, or equivalent residential unit, it's a unit of imperviousness associated with a residential parcel, is the most popular way of doing it, and it makes sense. Because why? You're pinning your fee to an impervious area that's man-made. Mother Nature didn't put it down, we did. We put down parking areas, we put down asphalt, other surfaces, basketball, and we put down our homes. And so if you were to come with a cookie cutter, a value of say 3,000 or 10,000 square feet, you would associate a monthly value to that, say $3, something like that. That's a pretty standard fee. There are higher fees depending on the needs of the community, but that's probably a pretty good average, $3 a month for the residents. Then at the top, you'll see what's called resident equivalent. That is a fee that's spun on rainfall amounts, which would be interesting in one way to think about that in terms of climate change. There's also a flat fee. That's one way of doing it. And some larger cities tend to start out with a flat fee, then they move towards an impervious-based fee. One thing that's important is if you have a structured fee approach or a different rate for different sizes, make sure that they're fair and equitable. So in other words, the larger payers, the major stakeholders we call them sometimes, don't let them pay a lot less than the residents, because then the residents in and of themselves are footing the bill, and that's not fair. Your feasibility study costs are going to change on the year that they're associated with. You're going to start off with planning costs just to find out how you're going to move forward. So that's what this is showing you in this sort of colored font thing. planning would be green, and then capital improvements turn to purple, and then we have that pink zone of maintenance, which is a significant cost. During implementation, you're going to want to have a GIS system because, well, we all have them anyway, so we might as well use them effectively. And you can, from that system, you can associate an impervious area for every parcel. Sounds like that would be a really tough thing to do, but to some extent, that's why we have this tiered system where if you have a residence, that could be something you wouldn't have to digitize because they would be associated with that fee for that month. But you would need to do a digitization for shopping centers, churches, and places such as that. A credit manual is very important, and Jay mentioned that. The credit manual really incentivizes the impervious approach. How's that so? The credit manual allows you to lower your monthly fee depending on what you do. If you can hold the water or if you can treat the water. So water quantity and water quality are an important aspect of that. And there needs to be an appeal process. People will have unique situations and you need to work with them on that. Okay, outreach. I think I said that in the same sentence 3 times. Outreach can be via social media. There's very successful Facebook accounts. I can provide more information on that, where every couple weeks or every day, some of these more active in LA, Los Angeles County, they have a phenomenal program going forward with Facebook and very strong outreach, and they see the benefits of that. I personally like the public school outreach because it's fun to teach kids, and you're developing a legacy situation where you're informing students, and so they kind of know what you're talking about in the future. And also for board members, they love having pictures next to kids. It's kind of quite an appeal there. There are what I call a tent event, and a tent event is you invite other agencies to come. And I've set these things up, and they're a blast. They're a lot of fun. I invited the Army Corps, EPA, NOAA, FEMA, and regional water agencies to come and tell people in the state fair, what do they do? And they come, and it's a lot of fun. We have minnow races, we have plant raffles and rain barrel painting and all that kind of fun stuff. And so you make it family friendly. And when you do that, you can have that. You could also associate this with like public works days, something like that. So it's very useful, and it can be fun and educational. And then, of course, outreach to your not-for-profits, because they are your feet on the ground, and they're already very knowledgeable, and they'll be very supportive. Be very aware that whenever you do outreach, you have to be careful, because it can take only a small number of people to become a problem.
Okay. Well, we would like to highlight a great example of a community using a stormwater utility to fund their asset management program. The community is the city of Minneapolis, Minnesota. Minneapolis implemented an ERU-based stormwater utility in 2005. The program includes funding for their entire stormwater management program, including asset management. The fee has been challenged legally over the years, but has repeatedly prevailed as a result of meeting the 3 legal criteria mentioned earlier. They have a credit program and are continuing to refine it based upon feedback from property owners and observations by staff regarding the relative fairness of the fee among property owners. Minneapolis began developing their asset management program in 2012. They have 4 staff dedicated to data evaluation and project management, as well as approximately 20 staff devoted solely to field data collection. They currently use a variety of tools to manage their data, including Maximo for management of assets, GraniteNet for managing televising and inspection data, and ArcGIS for overall geospatial data storage and management. Like many large U.S. cities in the late 19th century, Minneapolis had a combined sewer system. In the late 20th century, they separated these systems. And today, their stormwater management system includes a number of elements, including approximately 570 miles of mainline storm sewer, 17 miles of storm tunnels, 25 pump stations, and numerous reservoirs and locations with structural green infrastructure applications. The overall goal for their asset management program is to improve future decision-making and to take a proactive versus a reactive approach to asset management. Primary drivers for establishing the asset management program include a need to better manage both regulatory compliance and infrastructure maintenance and replacement. Obviously, collecting the physical system data is a significant part of their program. They perform a wide variety of data collection activities, including sewer televising using 3 in-house televising trucks. They use this data to apply a 3-pronged approach to assigning risk to specific geographic areas and criticality to system components. These include assessing the condition of system components and evaluating each component's likelihood for failure, assigning flood risk to specific areas using the results of H&H modeling and floodplain mapping, and assigning risk associated with potential negative impacts to water quality based upon water quality modeling. A few of the challenges that they've encountered include initially defining the level of detail to include in their program. For example, what minimum pipe size should be included when performing data collection. If you do 4-inch versus 12-inch, there's a big difference in cost, and it takes a lot longer. And managing the vast amount of information that is being generated has become a problem. Now that they have field data and modeling results, they have to review and interpret the data and ultimately prioritize projects for implementation. This is a daunting task with such a large system, but they are moving forward, and if the work that they've performed so far is any indication, the process will move smoothly. We want to thank Katrina Kessler, the Director of Stormwater and Sewers with the City of Minneapolis, for taking the time to discuss her program with us, and we wish her the best of luck in the future. So now, we'd like to just talk briefly about potential barriers and issues. And with that, I'll turn it over to Mark to give you a little more information regarding public outreach.
Okay, thanks, Jay. As mentioned before, it only takes a few motivated, or I would call disconnected folks, to try to derail a stormwater utility. Another name I need to mention is Dr. Warren Campbell from the University of West Kentucky. Actually, Western Kentucky University. I said that wrong. I apologize. He is awesome. He puts out probably, I would say, one of the best surveys for stormwater utilities. You need to contact him. You need to talk to him. He's eloquent. He'll come to your meeting. He'll help you, and he'll give you guidance on other practitioners who've done a great job setting up stormwater utilities. And his biggest concern is also outreach, which is why we've added this slide. Folks tend to label the stormwater utility as the driveway tax or the rain tax, or even as extreme as the God tax. So you're going to run up against potentially a group of people that are that way. Remember, the not-for-profits are on your side, and really, when you first set up your stormwater utility, you want to have a major stakeholders meeting so you can reach out to people and then allow that information to be published within your local newspaper or outreach social media, however that goes. Okay,
well, and another problem is sometimes stormwater utilities stall after the feasibility study is performed. And this can be due to a variety of reasons, and these come from personal experience on our end. First of all, there may be a lack of public support identified through public meetings or even a referendum. Secondly, the community may feel that a stormwater utility would be too complicated administratively. They didn't really know what they were getting into. They may be intimidated by the additional technical work, such as database management and managing the incentives and credits program. Thirdly, the implementation step may be perceived as being too labor-intensive and adding too much time to the process. After completing the feasibility phase, some communities become impatient and want to explore other options to get to the money faster. And last but not least, there are other options, such as increasing the community sales tax, that are quicker to implement and more attractive to the communities, since they have the potential for having non-residents pay for the program, which has kind of become the trend, at least that we've seen in northeastern Illinois over the past couple of years. So these perceived issues tend to grow out of a lack of education and outreach of both the public and the community decision makers. This is why, as Mark mentioned, effective education and outreach is so critical. As we've discussed, the City of Minneapolis is a great example of using a stormwater utility to fund a stormwater asset management program. Their program has been tested both legally and technically and has survived every challenge. Through their example, we should all feel empowered to explore using stormwater utilities to fund stormwater asset management. Well, thank you very much. That's all we've got.
Okay, Great. Thanks a lot, Mark and Jay. So I'm going to take control back here and bring up the correct slide deck. Okay, so we've concluded our presenter portion of the webinar. Oh, I'm still not up yet. Okay, there we go. And so now we're going to do some Q&A and open discussion. And I guess to get it started off, we've prepared a couple questions based on your presentations. So Ned is going to get started with a couple questions for the presenters.
Hey, thanks, Dan. So the first, and I would add to it, for those of you who are interested in asking questions, you can feel free to either unmute yourself or type a question in the chat box. The first question will be kind of for Jay and Mark, and thinking about stormwater utilities and how they relate to asset management. In our last webinar where we talked more about what is an asset and thinking about how we can define different assets, one of the things we thought about is really assets are things that are valuable to water systems and to communities, and the way you place value on them is by kind of assessing how they help support these communities. And when you're with the stormwater utilities, what I was understanding from your presentation is that if you start assessing fees based on impervious surfaces, are you then making these permeable surfaces? Would you consider these assets that then need to be managed? And then if you could again talk a little bit more about how you would start to value those.
Okay. Now, the actual asset management comes into play when you're looking at your maintenance and your overall capital improvement costs. So the imperviousness themselves is elegant because that's the cause, or I'll say the force, that degrades your asset management, your assets. Sorry, that's the force that degrades your assets with erosion and with decay of concrete, basically, I think probably being a pretty big deal. And with the rainfall increasing with climate change, that's even a bigger deal. What's the elegance of using impervious areas is not necessarily just the fact that the impervious areas exist, but it motivates people to change those impervious areas to lessen the amount of runoff from their property. And from that, that's why the credit manual provides incentives to, I'll say, repair or improve the assets. So asset management is improved really by the credit manual.
Yeah, and I'll just add one thing to that. If you had, let's say, a parking lot that had detention or storage within the parking lot itself, so that the parking lot could be defined as part of the stormwater management system, then you could include that as part of the asset management program for stormwater. But other than that, the impervious area or the parking lot itself would not technically be part of the asset set that you'd be managing or funding. So just to put something specific to your question, for an asset management program for stormwater, it would definitely have to be defined as a stormwater asset. Does that help?
Yes, that is great. Thank you. Thank you for that answer. And that brings up another question when we're talking about kind of the value of water, and Jeff was bringing this up a little bit in his presentation. So maybe I'll call on Jeff next to talk about, if you could talk about whether the work that you do in looking at rate setting and developing these dashboards, is that used in any community engagement efforts to talk more and speak about the value of water and trying to help communities understand more of the costs associated with the delivery of water, drinking water, and wastewater services?
Sure. So the tool I showed that with the dashboard was developed as a local government communication tool, not directly for the population, but more for governing board members. So we have a lot of reports from utility directors that use that tool to communicate the value of sufficient rates to their governing board members. every year we get lots of emails from utility directors saying that they got a rate approval because their board better understood the necessity for fuller cost pricing. We have some other tools that, and we've done other research that's more outward facing to the population. We do have population that will, general public that will look at our dashboards, but it's fairly infrequently. But we have a lot of guides, and there's a lot of great work done by professional associations, the American Water Works Association, the U.S. Water Alliance, on tools that utilities can use to promote the value of water. So it is part of our work as well. We would argue that, you have to communicate to the governing board members, you have to communicate to the public, you have to communicate to, in some cases, regulators, and there's different tools for each of those communication tasks.
Thanks, Jeff. So I have a question typed in here from Ankita Mandalia at Chesapeake Bay Foundation, and I'm going to read that question off in just a moment, but I'm intrigued with a follow-up question here, and this would be for Robert. And I wonder, in light of Jeff's presentation, do you guys at Penvest use similar tools, or do you make an effort to connect communities with tools like Jeff or UNC Finance Center put out there? Or maybe something, an analog to that on a state level, or do you see space to do that in the future?
We don't necessarily make connections on, here's a list of folks that can assist you, that type of thing. The outreach and the connections we primarily are putting forth our efforts in are really the education cycle of the importance of asset management, why it's important, how we can incentivize that. But as far as like maintaining a list of different organizations and agencies that can provide on that, we don't maintain something like that in our toolbox, primarily because we are a low interest construction loan program, where our focus is primarily on the construction of a project. So that is a great suggestion, though, that maybe we look into expanding our toolbox to maybe include some of those links. So thank you for that comment.
Okay, thanks, Robert. So I'm going to read this question from Ankita, and I believe this would be directed mostly at Jay and Mark. And she would like to know, how do you justify establishing a stormwater fee while also promoting green infrastructure implementation on private and mostly residential properties?
Okay, I think we can, what will happen is, I think it would automatically be, on the way that you've written the credit manual, will incentivize private property owners to go more green, because that will lessen the amount of runoff coming from their properties. So that is a lot of the benefits. One of the strongest benefits for stormwater utilities is everyone's involved. There's no feeling like there's a separation. And however, you have to be careful the way you write your credit manual. Obviously, you can't give everything away, but rain gardens, the city of Rock Island actually set up their stormwater utility based on rain gardens, and incentivizing rain gardens as a method for lowering your fee, your monthly fee. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I wonder, my interpretation of the question is that if community became so motivated to put in green infrastructure, and so they got all of these credits from the manual, would you be cutting off your own revenue source to the extent that at some point you might not be able to fund your utility, or would that lead to raising base rates or something like that?
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
That's a very good question, and that's why the credit programs, if you look at the amount of credits that you are available for various types of green infrastructure or volume reducing practices, they're usually in the 20 to 30% range. You shouldn't be awarding a 100% credit for a community. Then you start having a legal issue too. So the point is there should be a reduction, and that's why we mentioned the voluntary nature, is that somebody, if they are putting in green infrastructure and there is a benefit, they should be having a reduction, but it shouldn't, as you continue to review your rate over time, you would have to take into account any reduction in that, in the fee. So yeah, and that is something that's been considered in the past, is that the overall impact over time of awarding these credits could necessitate having to reevaluate the overall fee for for your rate structure.
And for instance, also the city of Rantoul, Illinois, actually had their fee sunset. In other words, it wasn't set for perpetuity, but they actually said, we're doing this for these specific projects, and then we're going to phase it out. So your question really is forward thinking and saying, could there come a point where there be no fee? And the answer is yes. There could come to a point where there's no fee.
Great.
And again, that depends on what it's
depends
on the program.
Correct.
If it's for something such as just capital improvements that there are a finite number of capital improvements you had already defined, and that's all it's going to fund, yeah, there could be definitely a sunset to that fee.
Great. Thank you guys for that perspective.
So I wanted to come back to some of the questions about affordability that Jeff and Robert raised. And Jeff, you mentioned that there are a few, I was curious if you have any case studies or examples that you could share of where communities, what types of options that communities can use to both address affordability concerns while also balancing the need for capital improvements.
Sure, and I know I just hinted at that with one bullet, but it's a huge area that our center, as well as a lot of organizations across the country, are working on right now. As a source of case studies, I would point anybody that's interested into two documents. One is a compendium of customer assistance programs that the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency put out 3 or 4 years ago. And the other is a document that we worked on, where we worked with a number of national professional organizations and did a state-by-state legal analysis of what is possible in each state as far as utility-oriented customer assistance programs. And that's in the world of actually providing direct assistance to a customer, which I think in many communities in the Great Lakes, that has become a strategy. You can look at, communities like Detroit and see what they've done as far as customer assistance programs. And those are pretty complicated systems that involve, in many cases, credits on the bill, where one group of customers essentially provide a subsidy for another group. You have the city of Philadelphia that is experimenting with income-based rates, where it actually starts to look a little bit more like a tax, where what you pay is linked to your income rather than how much water you use. And then there are some volunteer programs we see all over the country, where those are just charitable organizations that are helping communities pay their water bill, just like they might help communities and individual households with any kind of social need. There's also some things you can do with rate setting as well, but that's a little bit trickier. You're not going to address all of your affordability issues by just the way you structure your rates. So most of the communities that we've seen that are really serious about it, they are doing something like the campaign that Detroit or Philadelphia or Baltimore or some of the other big cities have done in the last few years.
Hi, everyone. This is Victoria Pebbles. I'm also with the Great Lakes Commission, and I work with Dan and Ned. And I wanted to ask a question for all of the panelists. As I listened to you, and thanks again for your commentaries today and sharing your knowledge. So, Jeff, we heard about, thinking about revenue sources for these different water needs. And Dan mentioned at the beginning, why are we calling this project integrated water asset management? And we're looking at the drinking, the waste, and the storm. All of this is being part of the same water spectrum, if you will. Jeff, you talked about rates a lot. Robert, you talked about loans. And Jay and Mark, you talked about stormwater utility. I'm wondering if each of you could comment on what opportunities do you see to extend these financing tools across the water spectrum, i.e., Jeff, rates. We're typically thinking about rates. We think about drinking water side of things, not only, but primarily. Obviously, with Jay and Mark, stormwater utility, it's stormwater focused, not drinking water focused. So what opportunities do you see to kind of cross and better integrate across water needs from use to management after use?
Sure. Well, I can say that I think two of the most powerful but also most buzzy, like from a buzzword standpoint, ideas out there are asset management and One Water. They're really powerful concepts, but we're trying to figure out what they mean. And there are people that use the term asset management to mean lots of different things. This term One Water has really picked up a lot of excitement over the last couple years. And I think what your question is fantastic because it does show that with integration and with a more unified view of water infrastructure and environmental protection, you probably can do more. We're just trying to figure out what that means. For some communities that we've worked in, there has been an effort in the last few years to integrate their water, wastewater, and stormwater utilities. So they might have separate fee structures, but the decisions about where to invest those money are made by one central management body. That's still fairly uncommon. Most cases you have stormwater, which is in the engineering department, and the water wastewater utility might be over in the water utility. But those are the kind of things you can do. Trading is another thing that can connect all of these different things together. Should you use your limited public money by doing stormwater water quality improvements when on the wastewater side you maybe could get more of a bang for your buck. So we're starting to see, managers of stormwater utilities talking more with managers of wastewater utilities, maybe even in a different town, about ways they could all work together. So those are some of the things that we're looking at. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but that's some of the things that we're paying attention to.
Thanks. Other panelists, if you would care to comment?
Sure. This is Rob with Penvest. I know that for us, you struggle with how to determine affordability and how to apply a fair and equitable affordability analysis across sectors. And one example is stormwater. Our previous program didn't necessarily look at affordability for stormwater, but we're moving that way to incentivize user fees for stormwater projects in communities, recognizing, again, there's not enough grant money to go around. And the way our analysis was initially set up, it was actually rewarding folks that didn't have a user fee in place to get grant money. So what we did is we started doing an analysis and looking around to say, all right, what models are out there for determining affordability when it comes to stormwater? There's a lot of published data when it comes to affordability for sewer. There's a lot of published data when it comes out to affordability analysis for drinking water, but nothing was out there for stormwater. And when we started looking at it, how do we set it up? At the end of the day, to get started, what we ended up doing is looking at communities and what are you basically charging now, and looking at the median household income of those areas. And what we came up with at this point in time is, 0.25% is basically what would be considered affordable when it comes to what's currently being charged within communities of different socioeconomic areas. And across the board, it comes out to be about 0.25%. But in answer to your question, I use that as an example of the difficulty of trying to determine what's affordable uniformly across all sectors when it comes to drinking water, wastewater, stormwater, non-point source pollution issues, all kinds of things. So at this point in time, I would say there's a little bit of a lack of data or a gap that would be foundational in creating kind of a one water. And I think it's certainly, would be interesting to pursue and something that will probably be further looked at as time goes by. But that's where we struggle in our affordability analysis of, what's affordable for some of those other things. And you could talk to 40 different people and get 40 different answers right now. So there's just not a lot of data out there to base decisions on.
Great, thanks. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Mark and Jay.
Yeah, we do, Mark. And I think if you're trying to say that, there's one water and everything, and I think that's a potentially really great idea. But if I would suggest that for stormwater utilities, they tend to be more favorably judged for grant money because they have a stable funding source that they know that the grants will be paid back with. So that's one incentivizing thing. Also, it motivates people to protect themselves. When we have a flood event, and they'll become more aware of what rainfall amounts might do to their house. So education and outreach for flood protection awareness and for reducing damages can happen. I've seen homes out in Nevada, they have sandbags 24/7 right by the side of their house, and they know how to use them to keep that water out of their house, which is one way of handling that. And then the last thing is, as we mentioned earlier, it incentivizes people to reduce runoff, stormwater runoff from all storm events, which can give you a clearer water going back into the ground, and you can have better groundwater for wells and such as that.
Hi, so this is Dan, and following up on that with stormwater utilities and going back to the one water approach. If people implement green infrastructure and it eases pressure on the stormwater system, what about a scenario where that's also found to prevent CSOs, which has benefits for the drinking water utility? So that'd just be one of a million examples, I guess, of how these siloed sectors could be interrelated. But are there ever any conversations about how, for example, implementing a stormwater utility can benefit the other sectors and opportunities for synergies like that?
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, I think there's a big movement about looking at integrated water from an environmental protection standpoint, and as far as the EPA is concerned, they've been promoting exactly what you say, looking at the trade-offs between CSO reductions on the wastewater side and green infrastructure. And some of that was codified in a recent federal bill that was signed earlier this year to have this integrated water management. So we may see that rolled out in the formal EPA regulatory framework. On the local government side, if you just follow what a number of the large urban areas have been doing, including, I think, like Milwaukee and some other Great Lakes communities, but Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., they have been making some financial cases for green infrastructure as opposed to like building a large tunnel for a number of years. So I think that's out there, and it's a really important, I think, movement that we're seeing.
Okay, great. Thank you for that.
I guess in wrap up too, as we're thinking about this project, we're thinking about measures of success for what state or regional efforts look like to kind of effectively manage water across all these different sectors. And maybe in closing, we could go around and just hear what each of the speakers thinks would be appropriate measures of success for us in the Great Lakes region to be thinking about with effective asset management as it relates to financing. And I think maybe this can be just a good time to kind of summarize the points that you gave in your discussion. But if we could go around, I guess, starting with Jeff and then Robert and Mark and Jay, it would be great to hear how you think we states in the region could measure success for financing and asset management.
Well, I'll just end with, in our work, we see the value of asset management and a lot of other initiatives lowering costs. But even though I work in an environmental finance center, I rarely recommend to communities or states doing things for solely cost reduction standpoints and having easy measures of that. For us, ultimately, we see it as service improvements. So I would be focusing on measures of service quality improvements, and that could be environmental measures, it could be fewer outages, fewer floods. So that's just what I recommend. I think saying that you're going to do things and save a lot of money, I'm not sure it's true because sometimes you're improving service more than you are saving money, and it's also very difficult to measure. But I think some of the service level measures are a little bit easier, still hard, but a little bit easier to measure.
Thanks, Jeff. Rob?
I would say the biggest thing I see is the driver. In all things, there needs to be an adequate and appropriate driver to stimulate an effort or to allow an effort to evolve to be successful. And unfortunately, with a lot of the applicants and borrowers that we deal with, a lot of it's compliance driven. And within that compliance framework in which they're operating, whether it be drinking water, wastewater, non-point source, flooding, stormwater, the regulatory frameworks as they exist today don't necessarily take into account that asset management. And as a result, people tend to focus on what is it that I'm required to do to keep costs down, and what do I minimally have to do. And so when it comes to asset management, unless you're giving out all grant, and obviously that'll get people to come flood into your doors, unfortunately we don't have that capacity. So we're always looking at ways to incentivize, recognizing that right now in the current regulatory framework, there's just not a whole lot of incentivization to act as a driver to encourage municipalities to move forward with some of these efforts. And hopefully we want to be engaged with that process as time goes on, and certainly want to encourage the asset management and always looking for ways and opportunities to do better and expand in what we're able to do. So my closing statement really is one that there needs to be more adequate drivers to see the effort go forward.
Thanks, Rob. Mark and Jay, you want to wrap us up?
Sure. And I think that, for kind of a cheering section here on this side for stormwater utilities, has to begin with the success that we've seen, certainly in the Midwest and around the Great Lakes, of the sheer number of stormwater utilities that we've seen. So I think measuring success on two levels, regionally, Minnesota, Iowa, Wisconsin, Indiana, Ohio, these are all states that are really, they're all over 100 programs that they've established. So to me, we really have a lot to be happy about in terms of sheer numbers of stormwater utilities that have been established and remain successful. On the actual utility level, on the individual utility level, I think we measure success by the number of, specifically the number of projects and maintenance programs that are actually moving forward and actually they're actually able to succeed in terms of getting projects in the ground. So I really think it's important, and as I hear us talking about this one water approach and a unification, I think we need to be very careful, especially with stormwater utilities. Legally, we don't want to get too caught up in trying to unify these. The idea of one water. It's a great thought, but we need to really keep stormwater utilities as stormwater utilities and strictly a fee based, or else we're gonna run into problems down the road legally. The one problem we're having in Illinois is that it is rather difficult for communities to to move forward just from a public, a PR standpoint. They're having a really hard time selling this to the public. And that's why we hit the education and outreach topic so hard, because we need to do better selling, I think, on the ground in order to move stormwater utilities forward. So I think that's all we've got. Those are our closing statements.
Great, thanks, Jay. And for those who are still on the line, thank you for sticking with us this whole time. I'm just going to go over a couple final housekeeping things. We hope that you'll all join us for the third webinar of our series, which will take place on Thursday, April 11th, from 10:30 p.m. until noon Eastern Time. And our third webinar is going to focus on technology and integrated water asset management. And then furthermore, if you have more to say that wasn't covered, or you had ideas that didn't come up today, please contact us. We'd love to hear your take on financing in IWAM. If there's literature that we should be aware of, please send that our way and we'll give it a look. Other people who we should be contacting and talking to as we network and explore these topics throughout the basin, let us know. And if you think that you know a good community that might want to pilot some integrated water asset management in early 2020 or begin a conversation about that, then please send them our way. So on that note, thank you very much, everybody. We hope that you join us next time.